If you worked with Drupal, this is a common scenario that you've seen before. You create a new content type, and when you look at the Manage Fields page, there are no fields there. This is as of Drupal 11.1. Previously, there was a body field that was populated automatically, and now that's no longer the case starting with 11.1. So now no fields are there when you look at the Manage Fields page. But if you then look at the managed form display, there are all these fields that you didn't put in there, and they are just appearing. So, for example, for a content types, you get a title, you get who created the node when it was created, whether it's published or not, and then promoted to front page and sticky at top of list, which I think aren't heavily used anymore. Maybe they were a lot more in pre-Drupal 8 days, but now they're kind of legacy fields. But so it's interesting that there are these fields there that you didn't create that are just sort of automatically added. And when you go to create content, you can see those fields that we were just looking at appear on the form, the publish field, for instance, and then the title and all those other ones. So we're going to talk about those fields, and they're called base fields. So we're going to find out what their deal is. I'm Rick Hawkins, and I live in Seattle, where it always looks just like in this photo. I lead the Drupal team at Slalom, which is a tech consulting company. We're headquartered in Seattle, but we have dozens of offices. We have offices in just about every major city in the country and a number of offices around the world. I like to speak at conferences like this one, and I like to help organize events, including the Pacific Northwest Drupal Summit and the Seattle Drupal User Group. And I maintain a couple dozen projects on Drupal.org, where I am known as RL Hawk. So those 6 fields that we just were looking at on nodes, those are base fields, and like I said, title is sort of the most obvious one, and then those remaining ones that we were looking at. But of course, nodes aren't the only content entities in Drupal. Since Drupal 8, the idea of an entity has been sort of abstracted out. So just as a reminder, there are 2 different kinds of entities. There are content entities and configuration entities. And for purposes of this discussion, we're going to be talking only about content entities. And so within Drupal core, here are 5 content entities that are defined. And you can see the base fields are different for each one. And so when you have this sort of abstracted out concept of an entity type, what makes one entity type different from another? For example, a node and taxonomy term, they have different behavior. And of course, there is functionality within the code that does different things, but the skeleton of these content entities, the sort of foundational part are the base fields. So taxonomy term, for instance, it has a weight field, a base field called weight. It has a base field called parent, and that's because taxonomy terms are meant to be hierarchical, and so you can actually drag and drop them, or change the weight, place them under a parent, and that sort of thing. Nodes don't have that. They have some other fields that taxonomy terms and others don't have. The promoted to front page, sticky at top of list, as we talked about. So nodes do not have a parent, do not have a weight. You could add them if you wanted to sort of introduce the concept of hierarchical structure to a node. You could certainly do that by adding an additional base field, and we'll talk about that further. But looking at the other common content entities, user, of course, very specific needs for the user entity type, specifically around authentication and like the time zone that the user's in, and whether they are active or blocked, and what their roles are so very specific base fields needed for users. When you create when you create your website, you don't need to add these fields to the user entity type. They're just there automatically. Media is a little bit different because the fields that are needed are very specific to the kinds of the kind of media it is, but the common base themes that they all have is just the four or five that we're looking at here, including a thumbnail. And one of the things you'll notice is that there are some sort of common patterns. Status is a common one. For Node, it's called published, but for user, it's called status. And we'll see the same kind of thing with other entity types as we dig into that. There are certain fields that appear over and over, certain base fields that appear over and over again. And one sort of anomaly is you see that the label field for a lot of these entity types is called name in a lot of places, except for nodes where it's called title, and for comment it's called author. So these are things that sort of, when you're working with entities, they're kind of weird discrepancies between the different entities, and it's the base fields that are causing those discrepancies. So there are a couple of other base fields that are provided by a core entity types. And so something like path alias and the workspaces module, and now Drupal canvas has base fields as well. And so looking at those, if you've played around with canvas, you've seen that it has some fields out of the box that are specific to SEO and that sort of thing. So that's the meta description and the image. And that seems like, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, but that's the kind of use case where a base field really makes sense for having these kinds of consistent fields across all of the bundles within an entity type. So just a quick comparison, and I'm going to refer to fields that you configure through the user interface as UI fields, and base fields are the ones that are not configured through the UI. And so as I just said, that their UI fields are defined in the user interface, and then they're exported to configuration and in the form of YAML files. And with base fields, the definition is all within code, within PHP code. And the scope is different for the two different types. So for UI fields, this is all done on a per bundle basis. So you're configuring your fields for each bundle, and base fields, the definition for the base field is across all bundles. So bundles being content types, taxonomy, vocabularies, and that sort of thing. And where the data is stored is slightly different in that UI fields are stored usually across separate tables within the database, and they are shared. If you use the same field in different content types, they will be stored in the same table, but it is a separate table from where other node data is stored. Whereas with base fields, by default, if you're only dealing with a single value for your base field, it is stored in a dedicated column within the entity's data table, and I'll show that more in a bit. And then, as mentioned, the UI fields, you export them as configuration. With base fields, you do not; they live entirely in code. So, just taking a step back, there are actually quite a few more base fields that aren't really ever exposed to the user. So you've probably been familiar with, if you've worked with entities in a programmatic fashion, or you looked at the database, you've seen that NID is the identifier for a node. It's the unique identifier. There's also the UUID, and so a lot of entity types will have that as well. But so these all sort of exist in the database. They will not, by default, show up on any of the pages that we were looking at earlier, the form display or the regular managed display page. So just taking a look at those, so these are called entity keys. And so you can see that this is the definition for the node entity class. And the entity keys that are defined here are kind of the ones that we were just looking on that previous page, with the ID being NID, revision being VID, et cetera. And here's where The bundle name for nodes is called type, but it is not called that for other entities. And that this is where that is defined and why it's different um, for these base fields. There are contributed modules that define base fields, and so these are ones that all have define an entity type. So paragraphs define a paragraph entity type. Commerce has a whole ecosystem of entity types, product variation, order, um, discount, shipping. There are lots and lots of entity types that show up in the Drupal commerce ecosystem, and they all define base fields. The redirect module does group storage entities, if you've worked with that. Anything that defines a content entity, and these all do, will define base fields. And of course, if you're making your own entity types, if you are defining your own entity type in a custom module, you will need to define base fields. And I'll show a bit later how you go about doing that. There are some modules that don't uh, that add base fields to existing entity types. So modules that provide um, functionality that extends nodes, for instance, or users or taxonomy terms. So existing entity types, if you've used Rabbit Hole, you may have seen these that it actually adds 4 base fields, RH action, RH redirect, and the other 2 that are shown there. So if you look in your database, you will see those fields, and now you know how they're getting added and what they're used for. The scheduler module, if you've used that, adds 2 additional base fields just to add a date for when a piece of content should be published or unpublished. And then scheduler content moderation integration, which is a submodule of scheduler, adds additional fields to keep track of what the published state and unpublished state is within the content moderation workflow. Search API exclude is a module that allows you to exclude content from a search API index, and it adds a SAE exclude base field. And then there's another one called trash, which is sort of gives you a way to delete without fully deleting, and it adds a deleted base field. And there are many others. These are just 5 examples. So here we are taking a look at the node field data table, which is the main place that data is stored for nodes in a Drupal website. And on the left is the standard profile. If you did just a fresh install using the standard profile, you can see which tables are available. And there are these base fields that we saw earlier, NID, VID, type, etc. But on the right-hand side, I've installed all of those modules that we were looking at on the previous page, Rabbit Hole, Scheduler, etc. And you can see all of those additional base fields have been added. So when a base field gets added, it is modifying your database, adding a table to store the data that it needs to keep track of. For example, when a piece of content should be published or unpublished in the case of the scheduler module, etc. So, and just to sort of clarify how the data is stored, on the left is if you create a UI field, each one of those boxes represents a database table. So when you create a new field through the UI, it creates a new table for you to keep track of that field, and then it's referenced using the node ID or the revision ID to the node itself. And so you can see that it is creating a lot of joins. I have 4 fields here, and so for each one, it needs to connect. It needs to have a join to the various tables that hold the field data. With base fields, like I say, by default, if we're talking about single value fields, all of the data is stored within a single table. So it's sort of more efficiently stored, potentially easier to migrate, perhaps even faster, better performance, just because it's not as complex to make a query against the data. So defining the field is defining a base field is very straightforward. This is about as basic as it gets. I'm basically just defining a new base field called foobar. It's going to be a string type, and I just have to give it a label. And if you add something like this, you will get a new column in your database table called foobar, and then all the sort of default behavior for a base field will be assumed because in this case we didn't define anything else. But it is possible and so if we did this, if you went to your manage form display page or your manage display page, this field is not going to show up in either of those places. So this would be more like the node ID base field that we were looking at, where it's never exposed to the user. And that's the way this will be out of the box, unless you set the display configurable value to true for either the form or the view. So this is the key to making those base fields be configurable, either on the form display or the regular managed display page for viewing content. It's assumed by default that it should be false, so you don't need to specify false, but if you could certainly do that. But if you want any of the content to be seen by the user or any of the base fields to be seen by the user, you have to set one or both of these to true. And so taking a look at defining a base field in an entity class, in this case, it's the node module that we're using as an example. It is using a method called base field definitions. And this is the definition for the title field. This is straight from Drupal core code. And it's doing similar to what I was just doing on the previous slide, where it's creating a string, it's setting the title or setting the label to title. And then it's setting a whole bunch of other things, like title is a required field, of course. We know that from working with Drupal. It's translatable. The max length by default is 255. And then there are options set below that. And if you look, it says set display configurable form is true. And what that means is that it will be configurable on the form display, which we saw very early on in the presentation. The second slide was showing that you actually could see the title field on the managed form display, but on the managed display field, it does not appear. And that's because set display configurable for view is not set to true. So to me, this is really helpful to just understand Drupal, why things behave the way they do. Being able to see this and see, okay, I get it. It's not defined to be configurable, and that's satisfies my curiosity about some of the mysteries of Drupal and why it does what it does. And so the display options being set here are for view, it's set to be the label to be hidden, and the weight, and that it's a string type field formatter. That's not changeable, because the set display configurable is not set to true for view. If you wanted to use a different widget, the default one here we see is string text field down where set display options for the form. But that will be configurable by the user, and the weight can be changed, which is why you can drag the title around on the form, on the managed form display page. So it is possible to define or alter a base field in a hook implementation, and these are the two hooks that you would need to know about. The first one is for defining a new base field. So if you wanted to add a new base field for nodes, for instance, you would use hook entity base field info. And if you want to alter a base field that has been defined by another module on an existing entity type, you would implement hook entity base field info alter. And I'll show briefly what that looks like. So here's some code, and I've done this in a hook class, kind of the new modern way to do hooks, but you could do this the old-fashioned way in a .module file with a function. But here in this case, we're defining a base field, a brand new base field in the hook entity base field info hook. And you can call it whatever you want. I called it the name of the function can be called anything. In this case, it's called entity base field info, because that makes sense. And then within that, you just define your field. And then altering is very similar here. In this case, I am altering an existing base field using the entity base field info alter hook. So taking a look at the two different ways to define fields. On the left, we have the UI field method, and what we're looking at is YAML. This is not, this is four separate YAML files in configuration. On the right, we have a base field defined in PHP. So on the left, the top YAML file is the storage definition. So it's got the name, what type of field it is, some of the things we were looking at earlier, 255 characters max length. This is defining the way the database stores the data. So case sensitive and that sort of thing are database specific configuration or settings. Cardinality just meaning how many values there will be for this field. In this case, we're just setting one. And then the next one down, the next YAML file down is the specific instance for a particular content type or bundle. And it's the field I've created is called subtitle. I've given it a description. It's got a default value, and I've made it a required field. And then the remaining two, the next one is the view display, and then the last one is the form display, and then the last one is the view display. So it's defining which widget is used for the form display and which field formatter is used for the view display. So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see everything. I tried to line it up as closely as I could, but you can almost see it one-to-one. On the left side, the field is called field underscore subtitle because that's what the UI automatically does, prefix it with field. On the right-hand side, I've got the same definition for the exact same field, but it's using PHP to define it as a base field, and I've named that one base subtitle. But everything else is the same. Max length, that there's only one, it is translatable, etc. So if you implemented both of these, you would end up with the exact same field, except the one on the right will not be. You can't delete it through the managed fields, or you can't even see it in the managed fields page. So when might you want to consider using a base field? And really, there's a simple answer. It's just when you feel like you need a field for all bundles within an entity type, it might make sense. If you looked at all the examples that we were looking at, if you look at examples that we were looking at earlier, where a new base field has been added to existing entity types like rabbit hole and scheduler and that sort of thing. This is functionality that you want across all bundles, and you kind of want it always to be there. And so then you want it to be consistent. So if you're creating anything that has that kind of functionality, a base field is probably going to be a good idea. Some of the ways that I've used base fields are listed here as examples. Let's say somebody comes to you with a design for a page and they say, we want the title to be, we want to allow the content editor to be able to highlight a particular word and make it a different color. Obviously, with the default title field in Drupal, you can't do that because it's just a string. But if you defined a new base field and called it display title and made it use the WYSIWYG editor, for instance, you could then lock it down so the users could just choose certain features, but then that would allow you to give them control over how the title displays. And the other title, the default title base field that's created by Drupal could just be used for administrative purposes. Subtitle is another example. And meta description and image, that's like the ones we saw in for Drupal Canvas. If you wanted that for your other content types so that you could have a meta description that gets output for SEO or social media and a default image, you could create base fields uh, for that. And then something like a URL slug, if you want users to be able to enter the last part of a path and then use path auto to sort of prefix it with the things that you want to enforce and not get turnover control to your content editors to manage, to be able to change the entire path. This would allow you, having a URL slug would allow them to customize the last part of it, and then you just put in you use a token to inject that into the path that's automatically created. And for something like a URL slug, you want it on every content type. You don't want to have to manually add it every time. You just want it to be there. And that's where a base field might make sense. So the pros and cons of using a base field, the data model, as we saw earlier, and how it's stored is simpler in that you don't have as many different tables that need to be combined in order to get the data. It's stored more efficiently, which can result in faster queries. Specifically with views, if you're doing a lot of filtering on this data, it can reduce the amount of complexity in the database query quite a bit. It is guaranteed to be consistent across all bundles for your entity type. So you have ensured that consistency. Oh, it does mean that if you want to create these fields or modify them, it does require writing PHP code. If you wanted to update the schema, you have to be careful, but that's the case with UI fields anyway. If you want to try to change a text field to a date, for instance, that's not straightforward. So either way, schema updates are going to be challenging. Uh, it's just where you do it. Code is probably going to need to be involved either way, and migration of data perhaps. And so because base fields are consistent across all bundles within an entity type, you can't scope that field to just one. For example, with nodes, you can't scope it to just a content type, just to one taxonomy vocabulary without writing additional code. And then one of the things that I think um, is a downside to base fields is that it's not visible to site editors or site creators who are going to the field UI. They might get confused because the base field isn't there, even though they kind of already know, like the title field's not there either. But if you but it and if you don't set display configurable to true for either the form or the view, the field won't appear there. But that's kind of a good thing because you kind of have the flexibility where you could expose it to site creators and let them configure it, or you can lock it down and say this is not something that anybody should configure and just make sure that it's not set to true. So base fields are kind of the skeleton of Drupal's entity system. As we saw, it provides sort of foundational functionality for entity types. It differentiates entity types so that they have different functionality. Base fields kind of provide that foundation, as I mentioned, where taxonomy terms have specific base fields for the kind of functionality that taxonomy terms need to have. And that's a foundational aspect of base fields on entity types. So if you want to learn more, I think looking at definitions for within entity classes, look for the base field definitions method, and it will be for node and user and media. It will be a fairly large amount of code because there are a lot of base fields defined, but it will show you almost everything you need to know. So using that as just a guide for how to go about defining base fields, it's going to be super helpful. The entity API documentation on Drupal.org is helpful, and then taking a look at the API page for the various hooks that we looked at, both to add new base fields and to alter existing ones. Um, that's it for the presentation. We have some time for questions if people want to ask. And I do have a live demo too, so if we wanted to just take a look at a site that has some base fields defined or even some code, whatever you'd like, feel free to ask a question. I see there's something in the chat. Eric, is that some?
That's me.
Oh, it's you. Did you ask something?
No, no, no. Last question.
Oh, I see.
There you go.
When do you use YAML and when do you use base fields? Um, so the simple answer to that is really the only reason to use a base field is if you want the same field across all of your content types, for instance, for all bundles within an entity type. And you want to, it's very convenient when you create new content types, for instance, to not have to remember to add the same field every time. It will just be there. Otherwise, you should always use the UI and export and use YAML. Andrea, does that answer your question? Do you have a follow-up? Great.
Yeah, it's just when I'm writing a module, it's like, how do I know what choice to make for something, brand new that I'm writing?
Right. And yeah, since base fields are really meant to be used across the entire entity type, it's just a question of how, like it is the nice thing is if you're looking at a bunch of content that you need to uh, content types that you need to add for a Drupal site, and you say, okay, there are 5 different content types I need to create. 4 of them all need the same field. That just there's one that doesn't. It might still make sense to make a base field just because you can remove the the base field from that one content type that you don't need, that you don't actually need it for. So you remove it from the form display, manage form display, and also from the manage display page.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Sure. And I think if you're writing, there are a lot of use cases that I can think of that would be sort of a general purpose tool that you might write and contribute back to Drupal.org. I mentioned the display title, which I think probably somebody already has written. If you wanted to sort of have a separate field that was really just meant for display, that you could have it be different from the admin title. The idea of having a URL slug. I think that's functionality that would be really nice, I think, to have. And if you created a contributed module, you would implement hook entity base field info and define that path slug or URL slug base field, and then you would be and then you would get that it would get automatically added whenever anybody enabled your module. Their database table would get updated automatically with that new field, with the new base field that you defined.
But then you'd have to do things in YAML so that it's more configurable for them, or do you just use that base definition configurable type that you were showing?
Yeah, if you want it to be configurable for the site creator or the administrator of the site, so that users will then be able to have, if you want to have this, for example, let's use the URL slug example. If you want that to be in a particular place on the form, then you drag and drop it just like any other field. It's it would work exactly the same way, assuming you've exposed it as configurable. And then when you export that configuration, it will maintain that position, or it will define where that base field should appear relative to all the other fields on the page. I think that's what you were asking.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I've written a module now. I have to look at it again, see what I did. It's like, okay, did I do this right? So, okay.
I think just looking at Drupal core's code, whenever you're trying to do anything, just look, it's going to provide just such great examples. And so that's where, looking at base field definitions is going to tell you. A lot of times you can kind of guess. Like I find it pretty easy to just guess what I need to do within base field definition. And but if I can't, if it's not right, I don't get it right the first time, then I'll take a look at an existing implementation within Drupal core and go from there.
Oh, all right. Thank you.
So, like I say, this for me, it's just nice to kind of understand, even if I never created my own base field, I'm still using modules that do, and I love understanding the inner workings of Drupal. Uh, because it just makes me feel like just understanding it makes me feel like more competent, I guess, and more it just feels better to know why things are happening the way they are and why things within your Drupal site are the way they are. So, if you see the RH underscore fields in your database table and you're like, where'd those come from? Oh, it's the rabbit hole module. It's added some new base fields. And when you uninstall the rabbit hole module, it will remove them. Any other questions? Okay, well, great. This was uh, it was good to it was nice discussing, what the deal is with base fields. Thanks for joining.